How many short are we now, Sue? Did you hear me, Sue? Or did you answer on mute? How many short are we?
Sorry, I didn't realise. Sorry, we're actually quorate now, so we can make a start if you like. But just so that everyone's aware, I'm going to record. Okay.
Yep. Okay. So if I just start by bringing to everybody's attention the fact that this is a public meeting, so if we can keep our comments polite, that would be great. It's going to be recorded for minute-taking purposes, so if we can bear that in mind. If I can ask everybody to keep their microphones off unless you're speaking, and if you would like to ask a question, if you do want to speak, if you just use the raise hand function on the toolbar, and if you don't have, if you're on a phone perhaps that doesn't have the raise hand function, if you can just write into the chat, that would be great, and I'll try and get your questions asked at an appropriate time. It may not be as soon as you put your hand up, but we will try and interject when we have a suitable break. If that's okay, has anybody got any questions about the technology? In that case, thank you. Welcome, everybody. We won't do our normal introductions because it's far too complicated on the screen. So if we can just, I'll introduce the speakers one at a time. If possible, if you can refer to the papers separately, and if we have specific questions about items on the agenda that we need to see on the screen, Sue, if I could ask you to be prepared to share your screen, with us so that we can come to the text if we have an issue with that part of the text, but we'll keep it off while we're moving smoothly.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so if we can then go straight on to the minutes of the meeting on the 24th of November, and we'll take actions arising as they come. So anything off page 1? Page 2. Budget monitoring is on again today. So anything on page 3? The deficit reduction plan is also on the agenda for today. Page 4. Page 5. And page 6, we already have an amendment to the minute on page 6, which is the identification that the fraud section was already incorporated into the documentation. So that has been amended already. That is on your minutes of today's meeting. Any comments from those minutes? Can we accept that they are a true record? Can I have somebody to put their hand up and acknowledge that they are a true record? Thank you very much, John, and thank you, everybody. That is seconded and noted. Thank you. Okay, if we can move then on to agenda item 4, which is a report from Andrew Snow on the energy purchasing schools. Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. First of all, apologies for the typing errors that were raised, I believe, at the pre-meeting. I meant to use the word changes instead of increases, and I would normally run it past my colleagues at work, but I'm, like everybody else, working from home. I've provided Sue with a clean copy if you want an updated one. Obviously, what I'm going to talk about is only applicable to the accounts that are part of the Crown Commercial Service Framework Agreement. This year, we're coming to the end of the current 2020-2021 year. And normally, at somewhere around mid-year, I would calculate expenditure using the annual quantities used by the suppliers to develop their pricing. Of course, these became completely uncertain from the 23rd of March last year due to the first lockdown, and that uncertainty has persisted. The projection of costs depends on energy use characteristics remaining relatively stable, and 2020 has been anything but stable and, if anything, highly unpredictable. So we've got a certain amount of unpredictability in the process. We also had to contend with the transfer of our gas accounts, corporate and schools, from Corona Energy to Total Gas and Power. This was delayed due to a number of historical debt issues. The transfer process was not started very early, and this resulted in a delay in the transfer, which delayed the switch to the lower rates, unfortunately. Thankfully, this delay happened over the summer, where we don't, the demands for gas aren't as high, but it is a slight missed opportunity. We've got another transfer coming up. The electricity supplied by British Gas Business will switch to EDF on 1st of April this year. We've been working with British Gas Business since the summer to clear any issues. Unlike Corona, who blocked the transfer of entire groups of accounts, BGB will only block individual accounts that are still showing historical debt. We're currently working through the list of debtors and are contacting individual budget holders to resolve the issues, and we obviously request your assistance in this matter. The consequence of any electricity account that does not transfer to EDF is a 56% rise in unit cost rates, which is substantial. This is an estimated figure and may be higher in certain cases. In the report, given the uncertainties, I've suggested a number of changes to the 1920 expenditure as provisions. Maintain provision for natural gas supplied by Corona, but all but one of the school's accounts has now transferred to Total Gas and Power. Reduce the provision for natural gas supplied by Total Gas and Power by 15%. Reduce the provision for electricity supplied by British Gas Business by 15%, and reduce provision of electricity supplied by EDF by 6%. So we're seeing the reductions. I've been fairly cautious in suggesting the reductions because there are some issues with winter use of energy that I can't be certain because we've got no precedent. The final issue that I have to let you know about is to do with the environment and climate emergency that was declared back in July 2019. I've managed to talk nicely to the climate emergency budget holder, and they've agreed to finance the purchase of green electricity for the 2021-22 financial year, and will reimburse the costs to the individual cost centres. All the green electricity is backed by renewable energy guarantees of origin. It's a relatively small amount, but we know that everybody is pressed for for funding at this time. Hence, us, although we know that a lot of schools would be very keen to take on green electricity, we thought it best to act centrally and at least bankroll this for a year. I can now attempt to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Thanks for keeping it brief. Can I just pick one thing up on the move towards green energy? Are there any incentives or grants for schools to help them in some way get involved for that?
There was a government scheme called the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund. We tried, the original date for completion of projects was 31st of March. And all projects had to go through procurement, be subject to governance. And I don't think that was practical at all. We did try to gain funding for a couple of schools to take them out of using liquid fuels and switch to an alternative, and to prepare a decarbonisation plan. But this was, we weren't successful in that bid. We understand from our peers that there may be subsequent rounds, and if we're better, the timeframes are just ludicrous for implementation, but we will keep an eye out and see what happens. But there's at this stage, they are asking for the impossible. We have an application for funding in for some for small works on corporate or on council buildings that we feel would be possible to achieve by a modified deadline of 30th September. But to try and get people on site during a pandemic to do the physical surveys that requires, you'll appreciate, is extremely difficult. But we are aware, and we are in the loop for funding opportunities that come in through the local enterprise partnership. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Andrew. It's just obviously lots of schools want to get involved in this. It's just a very strange year.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions for Andrew before we note that report? No, brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you very much. Thanks for all the hard work on that too. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Okie dokie, thanks. Okay, if we move now on to the next agenda item, which is Stuart. Is Stuart? Yes, Stuart's here. So Traded Services Report. Stuart Bellaby.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. Basically, what I want to talk to you briefly about is just the summary of the annual summary that we bring about the Wirral School Traded Services. That's detailed in the report that you've got in front of you. If I just take you through it very briefly, just to say that for 2021, which is obviously the current financial year, we have 25 services out to you now. The full range is listed there within the report. What I've done this year for the first time is to indicate the services with a star, that basically those are the ones that offer the main annual service level agreements out to schools. And for the majority of those services, the schools are the main customer for them. It's not that they rely on income from elsewhere or etc. But just to emphasise as well, we had 4 new services offered out for 2021. We had the IT WAN, and we had 3 services that transferred over from Essential, which were basically the data service, Fisher Family Trust for secondary schools, and the RADI project. Most of you will know a colleague of ours, Dave Hollenby. That's pretty much him that's come back in terms of offering his service back directly to schools rather than via Essential. So that's for 2021. The bit that you probably mostly get interested in is the actual overall income. It's projected for 2021 to be just under £4 million this year, which is a slight drop on last year, but it's still holding up. I've indicated in the report 3 of the services that have taken a significant downshift in their income for 2021 compared to 1920. Distribution services, small service. This is, as again, the main reason for the drop in income is obviously schools are now moving away from cash collection. And also in this particular service, this is mainly with G4S, so it's a contract, so it's pretty much money in, money out to if you like, to service the contract. We're less worried about that, if you like, from a council perspective in terms of the drop. The next 2 we are concerned about. IT services has seen a significant drop again in loss of income for 2021, and this is continuing a trend, unfortunately, over the last 7 years. As it says, mainly down to 3 schools, and also a slight shift in terms of how they're offering and the pricing, but also a large part is one school that became a large secondary, became part of a multi-academy trust. And the other one, which I know quite a few schools have spoken us to about, particularly when COVID hit, was around health and safety. And we have lost a significant amount of business to a new local competitor that was set up this year. And we have endeavoured to, if you like, to at least match what that local competitor is doing with our health and safety. But we have lost quite a bit of income there. One thing I know you ask me every year is about financial analysis. And we have done that again recently on an annual basis. What we've done on these services there is the ones that rely mainly on their annual service level agreements. And just to indicate to you that pretty much all of those services are at least breaking even. There is one service, however, that has needed a significant subsidy from the council for it to continue trading for 2021. I think we've had the conversation in the past about commercial in confidence, and I'm just wondering about if there's a way round. I'd like to share more information with you, but I'm conscious that obviously the meeting is being recorded, it's in public, but I do want to share more information with you, and I'll be take a steer from the chair and from Sue about how best to do that going forward in the future. But I am more than willing. I have got a suggestion towards the end of my short report around this, because I know you are conscious, but I'm nervous about saying what the detail of that information is.
Okay, it would be possible to set up a small subgroup if you wanted to meet with a small subgroup. That is well within the normal practice of forum. If that would be an easier route for you to report those things, to bring assurances. Obviously, we have a couple of questions for you, Stuart. One of them is about the ongoing concern of traded services, because we do need to be able to prepare. If some of those services aren't going to be available to schools, we need time to prepare to go out to the market to see what else is out there. The other is if those are producing really good figures and generating income, we would like to know where that is being invested. So those are the 2 things that we would like, I think, from meetings that we've had before in those figures. So anything you can share with us to enlighten us as to those questions would be greatly appreciated.
Well, coincidentally, Adrian, I'll come on to the last bit of the report now, if that's helpful, because obviously towards the end of the report, I talk about a traded services review that's been put forward as part of the council's budget proposals. So just to kind of assure you that is more aimed at a high level structural approach in terms of how we look at it. It's not necessarily, I mean, obviously one of the options we'll have to look at is about our school traded services generally. But the fact that most of them are breaking even, the council wouldn't save very much money by actually stopping those services, because there would be a net nil saving for the council. In fact, there would be a cost because of the redundancies. But there is one that I'm more than prepared to talk about at a subcommittee that's not in a public meeting, to let you know about some of the challenges we're facing over one particular service that we are looking at around solutions to that. And yes, that one of the options being considered is the fact that service we may not be able to offer going forward in the future. But you're quite right. In terms of that particular service, we do need to give schools notice. I have talked to colleagues internally about this one particular service and trying to say to them, we can't just stop it from April the 1st, for 2 reasons. One, that's not fair on schools to be able to get additional provision or go out and seek additional provision. And secondly, we're not sure if the market itself is ready to pick up and provide the surplus or the additional capacity that schools may want to do. So it's about working with schools if that is the option that we take. But yes, I think it's a good suggestion. I'll be more than happy to do that. And perhaps we can interweave that with the review that we're doing around school traded services anyway, because we do want to consult with schools and maybe do it as a subgroup through that.
And that sounds like a sensible way forward. Sue, would it be possible to put a request around for people within Forum who'd be interested in joining that subgroup? Could I urge you, Stuart, also, if there are services that are in danger of not being able to be continued, that we get as much notice as possible so that colleagues can prepare for that?
Adrian, without wishing to prejudice the outcome of the review, of course, as I said earlier, most of our services are at least breaking even. We do have concerns about one or two, and that's it. But you're right, absolutely. If we do go down that route, I think talking to internal colleagues, we do need to give schools as much notice. And to be fair, internal colleagues do understand that, around schools. So yes. So it without wishing to prejudice what may come out from the review, it is unlikely that we're going to do a wholesale change, but it is a possibility, of course.
Excellent. So can we put that as we note that report, and thank you for that, Stuart. Is there anything you've got to add to that, Stuart, at this point?
Yeah, just three quick things, if that's okay, Adrian. Just to mention, of course, this has been a challenging. We know this has been a challenging time for schools. There's no question about it. With COVID, and the pandemic, etc. And what we've done as support services to try and help you through those challenges. We've received many positive comments back from schools around how we have helped and supported. In areas like HR, even IT, MIAS. School library service. We've had lots and lots of positive comments coming back from schools that I think, if we weren't there, would have made it even more challenging, I think, for you as schools going forward. So obviously, one area I will mention, I think, was we did have some concerns raised about health and safety and just the speed of response, I think, from health and safety, certainly compared to a local competitor. And we have acknowledged that has been a challenge for us in terms of, certainly in the early days of the COVID pandemic, about getting the information out to you. And we've strived to try and improve that quality and efficiency and speed of information, particularly from the health and safety side of things. And it's interesting that at one point, across the council, we were looking at possibly moving colleagues who weren't, say, being worked as normal. Quite a lot of our school traded services saying they're actually getting more work during the COVID pandemic in terms of requests coming through from schools, requesting support, and because of the challenges you face. And it's different, uncertain times, and hopefully we were there for you in all of this. So the final bit, just to round off, is just to remind you that we have got our new offer out for 21-22. That went out by hard copy to schools just before Christmas. Electronic versions of that are on Wescom, and I think I've sent those out as well. And we've got a virtual launch event this Friday. We were due to have it a couple of weeks ago. We recognised that was not a good time for schools, just straight back after the break and all the challenges you were facing there in terms of closing schools for the majority of students. But that is this Friday. It's a virtual event. We recognise it. Obviously, we couldn't do it in person, so that invite has gone out to schools. We welcome schools to come on, but if people can't make it, we will record it and then send it if schools want to have a look at that. And there is an option afterwards to book on if you've got individual requests to speak to services. Of course, you can contact any time, but it's there, and it's open mainly for head teachers and for business managers as well. So that's just a reminder about the launch event this Friday. And I think that's probably it from me.
Thank you. So while we're looking around for any questions for Stuart, can I thank you for the open and honest way that you dealt with that, because that must be a difficult time. And to thank all you and your team for all the hard work that they're putting in, especially over this pandemic.
Appreciate it, Aaron. Yes.
You're doing great. Thank you very much, Stuart. Any more questions for Stuart? Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Stuart. Okay,
thanks very much, everybody.
If we can now move on to the next agenda item, which is the early years working update, which is Carol.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll quickly take you through the key highlights within the early years report, which is a summary of discussions at the recent early years subgroup meetings. So the opening section 2 is a positive informing of the all vacancies are now filled within the central staffing team within the early years teams. Which has been a real positive for us to respond effectively to the continued COVID-19 situation, and specifically the new lockdown that came early January, and the impacts that was having on the early years parents' understanding and providers in offering the places. So that capacity, 100% capacity, was really welcomed. Item 3, that's giving information on the take-up of the free entitlements for our 2s, 3s and 4-year-olds across Wirral, and showing a positive recovery position specifically for our 2-year-olds and 3s and 4s, and you can see the percentage increases. And what is also positive to highlight is sitting in line with national, if not slightly above. The take-up of the 30-hour funding does remain in a slower recovery position, and that's expected in terms of the continued furlough arrangements and the working from home arrangements. So that's just a slight reduction, and that reflects a national picture there. And we continue to work with our external supporters in business modelling for the sector. The key thing has been in sustaining sufficiency of provision of childcare and early education. And I think it's important to note here that at the start of, in March 2020, when we went into reporting on the number of providers, we were then at 372. And today we're at 366. So there was only been 6 closures of the main, most in childminders that naturally went and decided to take a career break. So I think that gives a real good picture of the work that's happened across the piece in terms of supporting continuous sufficiency. With that, I'd like to just highlight that Public Health has been a key partner in doing this work, in giving reassurances to the sector particularly, and have regularly provided cluster updates and information to give confidence to providers that they are working in line with safe COVID practices, and that in turn gives parents confidence that their children are coming into safe environments. So I'd like to thank Public Health as a note on that one. Item 4 was given an indication and highlight to how the funding arrangements have happened specifically across the autumn term. And you'll note that I did put in the report that there was, whilst in the autumn DfE was saying we were returning to a head count that would be of normal time, as in for the sector that children would need to be in attendance to account for them to draw down the funding. Later last week, I think it was late Thursday afternoon last week, we did actually get new guidance out that has a change of that position, and a positive change where the headcount that opened yesterday on Monday the 18th, providers are now able to report back and draw down funding where children are not in attendance, specifically as a result of coronavirus exposure, self-isolating, parents having fear and anxiety around this new position that we're in. So it was a real positive from DfE last week, and that's all in operation now. There were some exceptions to that in terms of if there has to be a signed agreement, so the place has to generally be available for the children, and as government stated at the start of this early January, all early years children should be in their provision. And if there's any restrictions on numbers, etc., that's not coronavirus related, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to account for them on headcount. But that's all in process, and that was welcomed last week in terms of the positive change. And then the last items 5 and item 6 just generally gives an update in one. The first one is around the SEND team and how the SEND team are now at full capacity and working with all providers and schools and parents specifically on ensuring their children are supported from the early identification of need. some real positives there. We're working hard in trying to respond. Now children are back in the settings as they came in from the autumn term, to the need that has been identified for a lot of these children that haven't been in a provision for a good few months. And what I wanted to highlight there particularly was that we've now engaged with the Autism Education Trust, and we're launching out as an autism training hub for Wirral's early years. That was launched last week, and we're starting to roll out in the coming months some specific work that will be tiered around awareness and then specifically specialised intervention work where autism is identified as a need. And there's other training programmes there that's highlighted. And the last section, section 6, as a follow-on to that, particularly we've been working hard, again, with providers and listening and understanding to their continued and ever-changing skill set required in the main to respond to our children as they return to settings. And we're developing Wirral's training platform, which will be an online, I'm going to try and talk techie now, an online early years professional development site where everything will be all in one place. There will be a free subscription for settings to sign up to this, and then everything for that setting or that school or provider will be in one place. So at the moment we send out information via emails or newsletters, or we have varied methodologies of communication and accessing our training that we developed last January. But this will go under one umbrella now in one place. And then for managers and owners of settings, they'll be able to have their own setting view of where they're up to in terms of their professional development of their staff. It will also contain DFE updates, Department for Education updates, research, and anything we feel that will be supportive in one sustaining and to childcare, high quality childcare on Wirral. And I think that summarises the report for noting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Carol. And can I just say on behalf of everybody at Forum that we understand how absolutely awful the situation that you face is, and that you have not only our absolute admiration, but our support. And if there's anything we can do to lobby for further support for you and for those early years providers who, despite all schools having been closed, have been required to stay open and then have had their funding under question for such a long period of time. So if there, anything we can do to support you and your team, and if you can pass my personal thanks, and I'm sure the thanks of Forum, onto all of the people within your sector, they are doing a great job in a really difficult set of times. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
I can't imagine what you've been through over these last few months. Has anybody got any questions for Carol before we move on? No. Brilliant. Thank you, Carol. You take care. Bye-bye. Okay, so if we can now move on then to the next item, which I think, Kath McNally, you're going to present the Library Services report.
Hiya, can you hear me? Thanks, Chair. My job share partner Louise Rice is also at the meeting, so I'll run through the report and then we're both available for questions if you need us. Just to update you on how we're doing, the first thing is the budget. We received most of our funding as de-delegated funding from the Forum, which we appreciate very much, obviously. We are now part of the Wirral Traded Services under Stuart, so we are beginning to generate additional income, and the table there just shows how that's beginning to come in. We don't do a particularly hard sell on this, but we have a couple of secondary schools buying in now for year 7 sort of material. We have 2 academies buying back into the service, and we offer additional services to our existing primary schools. So we're offering services, the loan of books, artefact service, AV materials, story sacks, posters, whatever, to the majority of primary schools, some secondary schools, and some of the special schools as well. Our priorities for 2021, we've been, apart from the initial lockdown at the very beginning of the year last year in March, the national lockdown, schools library services remained open during all this time, working in a COVID safe way with staff, and we've been very busy really. We had to close the library to teachers visiting, but we run a click and collect service which has been very well used, and we've delivered the bulk of our materials which go out at the beginning of each term to all the primary schools. Some as much as 20,000 up to 25,000 items would go out normally in a normal year at the beginning of each term out to our schools, and we've continued to deliver that service through the lockdown as far as we can and as far as schools require the service. We during the summer when public libraries were closed, we put out an offer to any schools who are interested to deliver books to children who may not have access to books at home during the long summer holiday. So we provided a book bag scheme, and we issued about 4,000 books which children then had, which were delivered through us and then to schools, which were given out to families across the Wirral. So children had access to books throughout the summer holidays, and those books have gradually trickled back into us, in the subsequent months. Going ahead, our aim is just to continue to provide as much support for schools as possible, to enable children to have access to books at home where needed throughout the COVID emergency and any subsequent lockdowns. And obviously, any curriculum requirements and reading for pleasure requirements in school. Our spring term orders, and the last of our spring term orders go out tomorrow. So we'll have issued about 20,000 items to schools in the last few weeks, which will have all been delivered now over the last few days. Our aim really is just to continue the service as best we can, and to continue to promote our premium service with schools, which is being well used, and our transition service to sort of try and generate income to support our de-delegated funding. As usual, we extend an invitation when things are better for anyone who'd like to come and visit us and see what the service has, what our library is like, what facilities and materials we have there. Anyone's very welcome to come in and visit us. Our staffing, we do all this on 2 3/4 full-time equivalent members of staff. Louise and I job share the post of schools librarian for Wirral, and we've an assistant librarian, senior assistant librarian Chris Taylor, who's just celebrated 40 years last year with Wirral Schools Library Service, and a full-time library manager, Wendy Bryan, who is principal manager of our artefact service, which is quite a unique service going out to schools. 3 times a year we employ additional temporary staff to help get the books in and get the books out, get the books shelved, boxed up and out on the van. We're based at campus, and we have full details of our service. The Wirral Traded Services brochure that Stuart sent out recently, has full details of our service. So that's us. If there's any questions.
Thanks for that, Kath. We've got a question from John Weiss.
Hello, John.
Hi, Catherine and Louise. Just to let you know, in wearing another hat as chair of Wirral School Governors Forum, we had a conversation a while ago about bringing you to one of our meetings, and it never quite got off the ground because I was overrun with people wanting to do that, but it was always on the back burner, and now my back burner has been put out by COVID. But I've made a note in the margin, and once things return to some sort of normality, I would love to be able to invite you along and have a conversation with you, or maybe you could talk to some of our governors about the excellent service you provide and what it means to pupils and schools. So I haven't forgotten about you. I just want to say thank you, and I'll talk to you again soon.
That's great. Thank you very much.
There we go, a glowing endorsement. Any more questions for Kath or Louise? No. Thank you very much for that report.
Okay.
Always
Thank
useful
you.
to see what's going on. And if anybody else wants to get in touch, we've got your details on that as well. So thank you, Kath. Thank you, Louise. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, then. If we can now move over to Christine for the report on the contingency, special staff and insurance costs.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Chair. Christine Thompson here. I'm part of the Finance Department and I provide financial support along with another team to colleagues in the Education and Children's Service. I just want to give you a bit of feedback today on 3 other services which are also funded from de-delegated budgets from schools, from our maintained primary and secondary schools. The first one is the school-specific contingencies, and this, as it suggests, is a contingency, and it's funding that's set aside and is used for exceptional unforeseen costs which it would be unreasonable to expect schools to pick up as part of their ongoing budgets. The largest sorry, Sue, are you okay to share the report? When Sue shares the report, in section 2.2 of the report, there are 4 bullet points which sort of give a bit of an overview of some of the examples of costs which are met from that specific contingencies budget. But by far the largest element is the business rates. In the school's budget share, the business rates element is based on information we have at the time we set the budgets, and it's before we know what the final business rate costs are going to be. So the contingency budget picks up the difference, any differences between the element in schools' budgets they've been given to pay for business rates and the actual cost of those business rates. Special, as well as schools de-delegating their budget, primary schools also buy back for this service as well, and the total cost around 221k. Just moving down onto point 3, moving on to the special staff costs, another de-delegated budget, and this particular budget, the use of this budget is to fund the cost of maternity and paternity costs for both teaching and non-teaching staff, and also to provide trade union facility support. By far the biggest element of that budget is spent on maternity staff costs, and that's about 90% of the budget. That particular element of the budget is an incredibly volatile budget and does help schools in evening out those costs. So, for example, last year in 1920, that budget did actually overspend. This year, it's looking like we'll have a small surplus on that budget. The third element of the de-delegated budgets is insurances, and the governors for our VA primary schools are required to insure of their schools for roughly an amount of about 10% of the replacement cost of their school premises. And the cost of that is shared across all primary schools by them de-delegating an element of their budget. We are at the minute forecasting a very small underspend on that budget, but if you can just see from 4.3, if you wouldn't mind moving down a little bit, Sue, the costs of that insurance charge have been creeping up over the last few years. So the proposal for next year will be to maintain that budget at its current level. That's a bit of an update on those services. I'm happy to take questions from anybody at Forum.
Okay, just to emphasise the point that these are funded through the de-delegation from the DSG, so these are for maintained schools only. So these are services which are only provided for the maintained section. Does anybody have any questions for Christine on this section, bearing in mind that we are going to make some decisions about de-delegating funds later on in the next agenda item, or one of the subsequent agenda items? Yes, Sue.
Just a quick one. It's mainstream schools, maintained special schools have what's called buybacks, slightly different.
Okay, so it's just mainstream.
Yeah.
Any questions on those? Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Christine. We are not done with you yet, though, because
No.
the next agenda item is yours also. So should we move on to the Falling Roles and Growth Fund? Thank you.
Yep, thank you. For 2021 budget, schools actually allocated an element of their budget to a falling roles and growth fund, which in total came to £644,000. At a number of meetings for Schools Forum, we were looking at different proposals for setting the criteria on how that fund would be distributed across our schools. At November 20 meeting, we agreed the criteria that the Falling Roles and Growth Fund would treat it as one fund and allocate it across all our schools, regardless of whether the element of change related to Falling Roles and Growth Fund. And the agreement was that we would allocate the fund based on a 3-year pupil number changes. And that would give us a trend over the 3 years. So that was schools that either had consistent falling roles over a 3-year period or consistent growth over a 3-year period. We also said that that finance would calculate those proposed allocations based on that criteria, and we will bring the results of that back to this meeting before we actually distributed any of the funding. Those details in Appendix 1, but just before we move on to Appendix 1, just a little bit of a background on the basis for allocating the fund. In looking at the pupil numbers that we used were the number on roll that is actually used to calculate the school's budget share. And that for any financial year is based on the census for the previous October. We made a couple of adjustments to those numbers, really just to even out anything that wasn't related to pure falling roles or growth. And the changes that we made was that when Kingsway School closed, in the particular year it closed, some pupils were transferred to other schools in year, and there was some additional funding made to those particular schools. So we have excluded those numbers. The other change that we made is prior to 2018-19, base places for high needs base places at mainstream schools were not included in the number on roll. So we adjusted that for 2017-18 to avoid a significant jump in numbers that would then distort the data. Just to draw your attention, that ESFA requirements are that for falling roles, only schools with a good or outstanding Ofsted rating can benefit from funding for falling roles. So when we've actually applied this criteria, there were 4 schools who, based purely on the criteria, our criteria, would have benefited from the fund, but because they had Ofsted ratings of required improvements, we've had to exclude them from the distribution of funds on this occasion. The way that we allocated the distribution of funds was quite straightforward. We took the total fund, which was 466,000, and we divided into it the number of pupils that would be generated by looking at this consistent growth or consistent falling roles, which is 1,607, and that gave a per pupil rate of £289.98. If I can just refer you to Appendix 1. And you can see there the range of proposed distribution of funds based on that criteria. There are 23 schools that benefit, which is roughly around a quarter of our schools. So I think what we've actually done, we've applied or proposed the allocation of funding based on the criteria that was agreed at Schools Forum in November. That information is in Appendix 1, so I'll be happy to take any questions from Schools Forum.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Christine. And can I just thank you for doing that work so quickly, because it was literally at the end of November when we asked you to do that, and it's been done, as far as we can see, directly to the criteria we suggested. I do have a question from John.
Yeah, just a quick one. There's a number of schools in Appendix 1 that have been given identifiers to hide their names or where they come from. And I know that this Growth and Falling Roles Fund is not applied for. It's applied by the local authority using the criteria we've given. How would schools know whether or not they are going to receive a proportion of this? And will we ever know as Schools Forum who those schools are?
I mean, I presented it this way just purely for this meeting, so we can have an objective view. I'll perhaps be guided maybe by the chair or that other schools forum, is that what we would do now is that we would then distribute the funds on this basis. I'll be guided by others where it's then appropriate for us to report back to schools forum at a later date to say who actually benefited from the distribution of the funds.
This is quite often the way that we do these, where the schools are giving an identification number, and then once the decision has been made, those schools are told which is their number.
Yeah.
We don't need to know what other schools or where those schools are, because if we're satisfied that the criteria we suggested have been applied, then we should be satisfied that this is the right thing to do. There is a second part of this, Christine, if I'm not mistaken, is that if there were to be a growth and falling role fund in future years, we are asked whether we think that this would be an appropriate mechanism for distributing whatever fund that would be in for that next or subsequent financial year. Is that right?
Yes, sorry, that's correct, yes.
Sorry, I'll come back to John. You got your hand up again?
Yeah, just briefly. I'm just thinking out loud now. So the schools that are in receipt of this meet the criteria. If there is a challenge by the schools, if they think that the way it's been applied has been unfair or unfavourable to them or more favourable to others, is there any recompense? Is there a review?
We hadn't planned for that, and I think what we did at the last meeting included in the proposal originally that we would ask schools to claim for that very reason, and I think the feeling of the meeting was that that would be quite an onerous task for schools, and that they were happy that the council, based on the information it had, would actually calculate the distribution of the funds.
Yes, if you refer to the minutes of the previous meeting, we instructed Christine to apply the criteria. So that negates the need for an appeal because it's based on actual student number. Is that clear for you, John?
There's always room for appeal. I remember I was involved in the initial discussions, and I don't know who the schools are. I'm just trying to make sure that we are prepared that when the schools find out what they've, whether they've been allocated any monies under this distribution, as to whether or not they can say, well, I'm not happy with the way that the 3-year falling roles or the 3-year growth has been applied. Has it been consistent? The disapplication of Kingsway and other things. I just want to make sure that we are prepared that that might happen and how we might go about it.
Has anybody got any other comments? I'm struggling to see how we could get to a position where we're appealing when we are based on a factual number of children in school and a change in that number based on the public census.
Yeah, I'm sure all the schools will be happy. It's just me sort of in my. I've probably been watching too much of Trump's campaign, so it might not have happened. But it's just one of those things. I thought I would ask.
We're looking for fake news.
Yeah, you never know. People have a habit of complaining about things you wouldn't think about.
Our job isn't particularly to make people happy. It's just to apply a transparent set of criteria.
Absolutely.
And
fair enough.
If the criteria were given to Christine by us and she's applied it, I think we are. Any more questions on that item? Do we have to note this, or is there any further action required from this one? It's a note the report. Do we feel that we would want this to be the distribution mechanism for any growth fund in subsequent years? Do we have to vote on that, Sue? Point of order. I'm just trying to work out whether that's a.
It wasn't built in as one of the recommendations, but it certainly would be helpful to have it as an additional recommendation, so that when Christine gets down to one of her later papers and we talk about next year's budget, that we've already got the process in place as long as everybody's happy with it.
Okay, so it's asking views of sorts. So if anybody wants to make any comment about that, if you can make that, put it in the chat box, and we'll collect those and maybe bring that as a point to note in a future meeting. Sue, can we leave that as an action, please? And we'll bring that as a point to a future meeting. But there are no comments coming through at the moment on that.
I'm just waiting for it to come up so I can type one in. It was just a comment I made yesterday that should the government change the criteria regarding the application of schools that are in special measures or requires improvement, if the government make changes and allowance for the fall in rolls, that we can incorporate it along those lines as well.
That would seem like an eminently sensible thing to do, given that we, in our initial decisions, we didn't think that it was fair in the first place. It is, however, legislative. Okay, so if we can keep that as a note. Thank you, Christine. If we can then move on to the next item, which is also you, Christine.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is the budget report for 21-22. I accept there's a lot of detail in this report, but so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on a couple of particular tables and then give people the opportunity to ask questions. If I could just ask members just to look at the table on page 30, which is paragraph 3.3.5. Just a little bit of a comparison there of our funding for our current financial year, which is 2020-21, and the funding for 21-22. So you can see there we've had a significant increase in funding of just over 24.5 million, which is about 8.9%. I have to point out, though, that of that 24.5 million, around 10.3 million relates to funding for the teachers' pay grants and the teachers' employers' contribution grant, which was previously distributed to schools as a separate grant, but has now been rolled up into the funding formula for both schools and high needs. Also, there's been an increase in pupil numbers of about 163 across our primary and secondary mainstream schools, and that's also contributed to that increase in funding. So although we're looking like we've got an 8.9% increase, the real increase for schools is around 4%. If I can now just refer you to Appendix 2 on page 41, just to actually get a view of what we've actually changed in the budget from our current budget of 21-22 going through to financial year 21-22. So our current budget, our net budget is 175 million. I've added back the academy recruitment because that's taken off and paid directly to academies to give our equivalent gross budget for 2021, which is 26.6 million. The changes that we're making for the 21-22 budget, if I start with the individual schools budget, around just over £1 million increase relates purely to the increase in pupils on roll. We've also got increases for business rates and PFI affordability, which will be reflected in the school's budget share. And that leaves about a 7.8 million increase, which is purely due to changes in the formula for the national funding formula, due to the increase in per pupil values and other changes in the national funding formula, and also the minimum funding guarantee. We've also made an increase for our special schools and SEM bases. Forum members will know that we've had particular pressures in our high needs budget, and we've got growth and this year, and we're looking to having growth in future years as well. In particular, we have an increase in pupil numbers, and also we have other growths in demand. So, for example, there's been identified a need for an additional Key Stage 2 base, an SEMH base, and a CAMS step-down base. We had similar demands in the prior year for 2021, and the way that we actually dealt with that is we addressed it by agreeing 40 additional places in our special schools. And we have the same proposal this year to increase the places in our special schools by 40 places, but those would be then allocated to schools later during the year following schools forum approval. As I've mentioned, we've also got a 10.3 million increase in our budget for the teachers' pay grant. And we have a relatively small increase as well in funding for our early years funding. And that's mainly due to an increase in the hourly rate that ESFA pay to us, or 8 pence per hour for 2-year-olds and 6 pence per hour for 3 and 4-year-olds. So that gives a total increase in our individual schools budget of just over 20 million. Moving through to our high needs pupils, most of the increases which we've identified here purely relate to the overspends we have now because of demand pressures, mainly due to growth in numbers or complexity. So what we've done is we've rolled forward that growth in demand into the 21-22 budget because we don't see that growth in demand reducing, and there are some increased growth as well. If I look particularly at the special school top-ups budget, where we've got an increase in 368,000, some of that increase is in line with the additional 40 places at the special schools, because allied to those special school places will be some top-up funding as well. And just look down at the nursing support, where we've got a reduction in the budget. There is a reasonable reduction in staffing costs because we've identified underspends on staffing during the year, and following a review of services which fall within that wider service, there will be some posts which will not be filled, and that's generated a reduction in the budget. However, that's been partially offset by an increase in the special needs equipment budget, which is currently overspending. In particular, there's also some growth in there for the provision of specialist learning beds at some of our special schools, because that will enable us to give more choice to parents. We're also proposing an increase of 40k in the contingency budget, again, just to respond to demand. So that brings about an almost 2.6 million increase in our high needs budget. I'll just move on to the central school costs. Some changes in the central schools budget. There's a very small change to admissions, but that's purely about realigning the budget so it reflects our actual current expenditure. I've also allocated there an 8k contingency budget. The funding for the central schools costs is a separate block, which is called the Central School Support Block, and we've had an increase in that budget, that funding this year, and there was 8k that hadn't been allocated, so we've just at the moment treated it as a contingency. A very small reduction to the licenses and subscriptions budget, because the costs for that are actually given to us by ESFA, so the budget has been changed to match the costs which we've been advised of. The increase of 212,000 for the PFI affordability gap is mainly due to inflation, but that element of the central schools budget is council funded, so the council will be providing the funding for that increase in costs. Whilst I'm talking about the central schools costs, I just want to draw you to attention to paragraph 5.4.3, if I can. Within the wider central schools block allocation, there are two types of costs. There are current costs in there, and there are also contributions to combined budgets, and these are support services that fall outside of the school's budget. These are historic costs, and they refer previously to a change that was made in 2012-13, and the expectation is that those costs will reduce over time. So there's been a 20% reduction in that element of the central schools block. But because there's also been an increase in the schools block for our current costs, but we haven't identified any additional demand, what we are proposing at the moment is that the increase will offset the reduction in the historic costs. So we have not needed to make any changes to the combined budgets. Sorry, Sue. Can I just ask you to move back to that Appendix 1 on page 41? So those changes that we're making for the individual schools block, the high needs and the central schools costs gives a total increase in the budget of 22.8 million. So added to our current year budget, that gives us a total gross budget for schools of 299,487,000. Our 21-22 allocation across all of our 4 funding blocks is 300,711,000, and that gives us spare capacity of 2,683,000, which we're proposing to be a contribution to reserve. That 2.7 million has specifically come out of the high needs block. So we have fully allocated the schools block, and we've fully allocated the early years block and the central services block, but there is spare capacity in the high needs block of the 2.7 million, which we are proposing to put into the DSG reserve. And because at the minute we're forecasting a cumulative overspend for the DSG of 2.4 million, that 2.7 million will broadly offset the deficit. What I'll do now is, before we look at anything else, I'll take questions at the moment before we then go back and look at what section, paragraph 10, which is the specific recommendations which we're asking Schools Forum to look at.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive run through, Christine. So at the summative part of this report, we're asking for some permissions, are we, that the views are sought on the school's budget for 21 to 22, that the net increase be used to offset the reduction, in that the surplus high needs fund offsets the deficit there, and that that we can then refer this views to the budgetary meeting. So is this a vote that we're anticipating on this? Is this to those in favour, those against? Sue, could you give me a steer on this? Sue,
there is no vote. It really is to take views back, because all of these recommendations will also be reflected in the council's wider budget setting paper that they will consider at the 17th February meeting. But if there are any strong objections to anything that we've outlined in the changes to the budget, they would form part of that council budget report, and the council will make the decision on the budget setting process.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. So if we can has anybody got any questions for Christine on that? It seems you were completely thorough, Christine, and nobody has any questions. And our people are comfortable with the surplus from high needs going to offset their previous deficit? Okay, and the use of the cost element within the central school service to use to offset the reduction in the historic costs. Any questions at all? We are all in stunned silence. Excellent. In that case, thank you for that, Christine. Very thorough and very clear. Thank you very much. Okay, if we can move on to the next agenda item, which I believe is Jakob, which is the de-delegation of schools budget. So can I just, before we go on to this, Jakob, if I can just remind everybody here that there is going to be some voting. So please, can we just summarise that the voting is for specific representatives within the forum. The primary votes are for primary maintained schools. The secondary and thank you very much, Sue. You're pointing out who can say yay or nay to these things. So those are the people who can vote in those categories. And when we're voting, if we can use the chat to write yes when I ask, and then no, and then abstain, and we can keep those sorted to give Sue a chance of making sure that she can record those quickly.
Adrian,
yes,
can I just confirm that Emma Johnson is substituting for Kate Takashima, so she is also able to vote, as is Julie Mary, who's at her first forum. She's so everyone on that list can vote, on that top list can vote for the primary.
Okay,
for the primary decisions.
That's fine. Julie, welcome. What a joyous occasion these four are. So I'm sure you're stunned by how wonderful the evening is. So if we can move on to Jakob first, if you can talk us through the report, please, Jakob.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, this is a de-delegation presentation. Yes, I work on the Children and Schools Insight team as Principal Information Officer, and I'd like to present this year's de-delegation schools budget report. If you can bring up the table, I'll just go through some of the points on there. Contingency, as Christine mentioned earlier, contingency covers exceptional costs that we would not normally expect individual governing bodies to cover. Compared to 2020, for primary schools, contingency has now decreased to just under 30,000. This year, we'll be making an adjustment of around 35,000 to behaviour support, which is a realignment between academy and mainstream pupil numbers, as you can see in the notes of the report. Contingency remains unchanged for secondaries, though, at just under £40,000. The fund is reserved for assisting excluded children in reintegrating them back into current secondary schools. Looking at special staff costs, compared to 2020, the rates remain the same. This is to cover maternity and paternity and trade union costs for all staff, teaching and non-teaching. Now we move on to library services. As mentioned earlier by Catherine, the service is for primary schools for the provision of learning resources, and these thousands of resources include artifacts, posters, DVDs, as well as books. This year, after last year's increase, the per pupil rate will remain unchanged at £8.78. Moving on to insurance that Christine covered a bit earlier. This is again covered by primary schools for liability insurance for aided schools, and the rate remains unchanged this year as well. Moving on to behaviour support, this is where the biggest increase has been. As mentioned earlier, this is allocated to teams that work with primary, secondary and special schools across Wirral. The primary schools rate has increased, and as mentioned earlier, includes £35,000 additional funding from contingencies for vulnerable children. The behaviour support funding for secondaries has also slightly increased due to increased SEN numbers, but not because of the rate. Looking at the school improvement, this, as you know, this replaced the Educational Service Grant in 2017 and supports the general improvement of schools, and again the rate remains unchanged. At the bottom of the table we have the former Education Service cost of general duties. This is very similar to last year. This fund is for maintained schools and includes special primary and secondary schools. It covers costs associated with landlord responsibilities, early retirement and other statutory costs related to finance, LMS and internal audit. The rate remains unchanged compared to 2020. And the recommendations that we were talking about earlier are on page 46, as you can see, of this report. And these are the ones that we would ask you to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakob. There are a couple of questions that have come in through to me. If I can start, before we start considering how we are going to vote on those de-delegation, I've got a couple of questions that were tabled. The first is about the school improvement and behaviour support elements of this. So the question really is that we haven't had an impact report from those, and we don't have a summary of what that is actually paying for or what is being done. So if we can,
yeah, I'm just going to ask some of my some of the members there for a bit more detail on that, who are in those departments. They have a bit more information.
Okay, so can I pick up Paul on that one? Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it may be helpful for me to pick up those questions. So I think it's a really good questions to be asking, to be honest with you, about it's all well and good working out how much money should be allocated to those critical functions, school improvement and behaviour. But it's reasonable to be asking, A, how is that money spent? And I guess the other question is impact, particularly when we know that we've got work to be done around school improvement and behaviour support. What I would suggest is that rather than me try to explain that to you in this forum, that I undertake to provide detail in a form of report back to the forum to show the breakdown, but also to raise some more questions really about the second part of that, which is the impact of the work that we've done around school improvements and behaviour. If that's acceptable, I'd be more than happy to take that forward as an action on behalf of the forum.
I think that is something that we've been asking for. I'm conscious that we've asked for some impact reports over time for that. That would be great. Are people satisfied with that part of that? The second element of the question, I suppose, is, are these services that are covered by the school improvement and behaviour support costs, are they provided to academies as well as mainstream schools, maintained schools? And if so, are those academies charged for that service? And then that goes on to say, if they are, where is that in the budget, and can we see that in the finances? And if they're not, should they be? And if you follow that string, you would say if they should be and then they are charged, does that mean there is more money in the pot, or the cost per school is less? That's a summary of questions that came from primary. I know Liz asked that sort of question, and Simon also asked that question from secondary. So could we have a first of all, are those services provided to all schools, academies and maintained? Paul?
Again, I'll jump in here, Chair, and say I can't hand on heart answer that question directly for the forum tonight, because I think it's probably a little bit muddled. To be honest with you, I think there may be some circumstances where there is a charge and maybe there isn't in others. Would it be acceptable for me to include within the reports that I've just suggested that are provided clarity about the relationship between those services and academy schools, which would include all the questions that you've asked at this meeting tonight?
I'm presuming that's satisfactory. I'll go to maybe the primary or secondary reps to say, is that okay? Are we going to charge Paul with that, and possibly give us the name of the author for those reports? Liz, you're on mute.
Yeah, just unmuting. I think my feeling is, yes, those reports would be very welcome, but they would have been welcome before we had to vote on actually giving quite a large proportion of money to services when we're not actually sure what we're getting for that money. I think we could have done with the reports before we actually have to vote on whether we're going to agree them or not.
Yeah, that's something we've asked for before, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Again, Chair, I accept that. So I will make that commitment. If you've asked for these reports before, they've not been provided, I apologise to the forum for that. That shouldn't be the case. You should have had those reports. I suppose the situation tonight is I wasn't aware that those reports had been asked for before, and I'm making that undertaking to make sure that they are provided. How that plays out in terms of these recommendations, I take advice on that, really. So.
Yeah, I'm noticing in the dialogue in the chat box, people are asking about postponing a vote, and I will turn to probably Christine for that. We can't carry on funding something we haven't voted for past the financial year, can we? Christine?
I mean that's correct, yes. And I accept that. It kind of leaves us with two options, I guess, is that if we suspend the vote, the next schools forum meeting isn't until May. So, and whilst it's a council issue, if following those reports, the decision is not to contribute to those services, we'll be having to then sort of, after the financial year has started, looking at alternative funding, or potentially having to look at maybe reducing those resources, of which some is individual staff salaries. So I guess the option is that we either have to suspend the vote until then, or the other option is whether forum members are prepared to commit to accepting, but only for a given period of time, say for the remainder of this academic year, and then following the outcome of those reports, if they don't want to contribute, then the contributions will cease from the beginning of the new academic year, which is 1st of September, which will just give the council more opportunity, if it's needed, to plan what it's going to do going forward.
Okay, so that would be a 5/12 commitment. So if bear in mind that this is likely to have an impact, if we were to not have this vote tonight and we couldn't sustain it, that would have an impact on people's jobs in a very short period of time. If we were to have an amendment to that, so we would say we would support it to the end of the financial year and commit to the 5/12 of it, and then review it when we get to May, when we should get the full report and be able to commit that vote going forward. Is that a suitable compromise for people? Sue?
Just a quick question. I'm a tad confused on writing the minutes. These decisions, I thought, needed to be made so that because they feed into the formula budget, and so if it's suspended, I'm not sure how that works with the formula, Christine.
Oh, actually, yes, you're right in that. Well, what it would mean is that you're right. They do inform the school's formula budget for the APT, and I might be guided a little bit by Jakob on this as well, as to whether or not it actually impacts on the school's budget share. And I don't think it does it, Jakob? Although we actually feed that information into the tool that we use to allocate the school's budget share.
I think it does, Christine. I think if the forum chose not to de-delegate school improvement and behaviour support from September, then you would only be looking at a 5/12 de-delegation.
Yes.
And if after the reports they then decide that yes, they'll continue with it, they would have to be a charge for that for the rest of this financial year. I think it's
potentially procedurally, I think that's probably the correct way to go. But I don't think it doesn't impact on the actual school's budget. But yes, I think you're right, Sue, that procedurally we are expected to present that de-delegation information into the budget information that we do submit to ESFA.
Okay. Let's have a think about that. Paul?
It's just a point for clarification, really, just to get an understanding about the way the debate's going. The questions I thought I was being asked were really about transparency of how the resource is being utilised, as well as some indication as to the effectiveness, not whether or not there should be a delegation of resources to support school improvement and behaviour support. So I don't know whether that helps or not really, but I think they are different issues. I think, you know, that it's perfectly legitimate for the forum to be asking for greater clarity about the use of that resource and the impact of it, but this delay or not voting would actually mean that we would have to cease school improvement and behaviour support services. So
yeah, that is a very different picture, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Taryn.
Thank you, Chair. If I can just follow on from comments Paul has made, the work of the behaviour support has been led by a post holder inclusion strategy manager, and it's had a dramatic positive impact on young people's lives and helping schools when young people are facing challenges around exclusion and permanent exclusion. I think most head teachers in this meeting, and certainly in the wider Wirral community, will realise the positive impact that that colleague had in the inclusion strategy manager on the lives of young people and helping staff in schools manage behaviour that challenges. I accept Paul's point completely that we need greater transparency and an impact assessment, but there can be few head teachers who have had behaviour that challenges in Wirral that haven't had a positive interaction with behaviour support.
Right. Okay. So we are presented with a vote, and I think the question has to be asked: Do colleagues feel that we are not in a position to make that vote? If we are in a position to make that vote, and we are satisfied that we will get more transparency going forward, clarity about not only the spend but the charging system with maintained and academies, are we in a position to take that vote now? Then, does anybody want to make a comment about whether they don't feel ready to make that vote, or they do feel ready to make that vote? Mr. Spencer.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. It's just the query is that if we went ahead with the votes on the 5/12ths, but then schools having to have a charge against them for the 7/12ths, is that a way forward?
We have done that in the past, haven't we, Sue? Didn't we do that with trade union facility time?
Yes, and I think we did it with MEAS as well. MEAS we provided funding to the end of August, and then they provided a service level agreement for the rest of the year.
So what I'm asking now then is the primary representatives, because I'm one of the primary representatives, are they happy to go forward on that proposal? Should we do a 5/12 and a 7/12 vote?
Is there any feeling that I'm just conscious that these are fundamental aspects of the provision that we've got on Wirral, and that we all benefit to some extent from both the school improvement work and the behaviour support work. We don't want to risk not having that at our disposal. Simon.
Yes, I agree with you, Adrian. I think these are fundamental aspects of the work across all schools, and we don't want to place this in danger right now. However, I do feel that we're boxed into a corner a little bit with this. I am happy to vote on that suggestion of moving ahead for the next few months, as long as we can revisit this in May. I would like to see greater level of transparency on the impact that this amount of money has, because I'm looking at 28 to £30,000 per secondary school. That's a large sum of money. So I'm happy to move on, because I do think, you know, there are people's jobs at stake here, and we ought to proceed to a vote. But this is something we need to return to.
Okay, Simon, could I just go back to you with were you happy to move for a vote for the de-delegation, or the suggestion that it goes 5/12 and then the charge?
The suggestion that we go 5/12.
Okay. Dave, you've still got your hand up. Is that a legacy hand? Oh. No. And Simon also. Okay. So let's see how we proceed with this. If we move to the vote, then if you can move to the page with the recommendations on, please. So thank you very much. So for item 1, then, that this is for primary representatives only. There are 3 possibilities. It's a yes, a partial, which will be the 5/12, and the no. Is that right, Sue?
Adrian, can I just confirm, we vote on each item separately, so we vote on contingency separately?
Yes. Each of these A to F will be a separate vote, so there may be a separate decision on those.
Right. So can I request, because there are so many of these, can I request that when people are voting, for example, when we vote on contingency, if you can put A in the box first, so that I know, so when I'm looking back on it, I can identify that they're all the contingency ones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm right in saying that we are going to say yes for the full year, partial for a 5/12 with a recharge, and no. Is that right?
I think I think it's a yes, no for all of them except for school improvement and behaviour support when we do the yes, partial, no.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So if we can get our fingers ready on the chat box. So for primary colleagues, that the primary reps agree to de-delegate the contingency. If you can vote a yes or a no. Okay, thank you for that. And for the primary, we agree to de-delegate the special staff costs, including trade union facilities time. So B yes or B no. Thank you. And for school library services, if we can indicate that we agree to de-delegate the school library service cost, C yes or C no. And for insurance, that the primary representatives agree to de-delegate the insurance costs. So that's D yes and D no. And for school improvement, that we vote to de-delegate the cost of the school improvement. So E yes, E partial, or E no. And for behaviour support, that we de-delegate the cost for behaviour support. So F, yes, F, partial, or F, no. And in item 2, that the primary forum representatives agree to a contribution to the former education services grant of 369416. That'll be yes or no. So 2 yes or 2 no. And for the primaries, if any abstentions, if you can write the A, B, C, D, E, or F, abstain, or number 2, abstain. Okay, thank you for that. And then for the secondary representative, this will be easier to count, Sue, because it's one. So, Simon, do you, on behalf of the secondaries, do agree to de-delegate contingency? A, yes or no? B, special costs, including trade union facility time, yes or no? C, school improvement, C, yes, C, partial, C, no. And for behaviour support, D, yes, D, partial, or D, no. And item 4, that the secondary representatives agree to a contribution to the ESG of 58,470. That's 4 yes or 4 no. And this final one, which is for the special school forum representatives, agree to the former ESG service grant of 72,114. If you can, 5 yes, 5 no. Okay, so that's given us some steer on that. Have we got those counted up, Sue?
Yes.
Okay, and can we have a report on that at the May forum, because that is going to be a matter of some urgency for all the people associated with those services. Okay. So if we can move on then to the next item, which is the schools funding formula. And this is Christine.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. At the November meeting, we reported back on the outcome of consultation with our schools on the national funding formula. And in particular, we're asking schools for feedback on what level of minimum funding guarantee that they would like. And the majority chose an increase of 1.25%. And also what they would like to allocate any spare capacity to from the funding, and the outcome of that was any spare capacity would be used to develop a falling roles and growth fund for 21-22. At the time that we actually did the consultation, the indicative allocation for next year's budget was 228 million. We now have the final allocation, which is 230 million, an increase of 2 million. At this moment in time, we're actually still calculating the individual schools' budget share. It's just timing, I'm afraid, of when this meeting fell, and and while we're actually preparing this work, that work hasn't actually been completed yet. One of the things that we also need to look at is members will recall that just before Christmas, we had a request to consider submitting a disapplication request to the ESFA to use an alternative MPPL unit value for our all-through school, and that disapplication request has now been approved by ESFA, but we're still awaiting feedback on how we will actually make that change in the calculations for the school budget share. Because we don't yet know the outcome of the allocating the school's budget share, what we wanted to bring back to Schools Forum today is that when we get to the end of that exercise, the last thing that we do in calculating schools' budget share is to apply the minimum funding guarantee. If we actually apply the minimum funding guarantee of 1.25%, that the consultation, the outcome of the consultation, if that actually means that there is spare capacity within the funding for schools for 21-22, and that spare capacity is more than, say, $500,000, we just feel that schools would have preferred us to actually more widely distribute that funding and to apply a higher minimum funding guarantee. So what we're actually asking Schools Forum for is their views on that, and that whilst we're actually making these calculations, that if the spare capacity after applying the 1.25% minimum funding guarantee is more than $500,000, that we actually apply a higher minimum funding guarantee to all of our schools, but whilst ensuring that none of our schools are capped. So what we actually want to do is to actually maximise the allocation of the funding to schools. And I'm actually looking for Schools Forum views on that proposal.
Okay, so any questions there on that one for Christine? Again, very clear. And any thoughts on that? Is it likely, Christine, that any of that that would result in anybody being capped?
No, we would apply a minimum funding guarantee to make sure that there wasn't any capping. I have to say, I was probably being maybe a little bit optimistic at the time of writing this paper. I'm not sure we're going to have an absolutely huge spare capacity, but I won't know till the exercise is finished. I think it is more likely that the spare capacity will be less than $500,000, but I just wanted to make sure that we had Schools Forum views if it was greater, but we will make sure that in applying the minimum funding guarantee that no schools are capped, so it's a fair allocation of funding.
And I think in people's comments outside the meeting, it makes no sense to have a huge amount of money floating around in a growth and falling roles fund, and that minimum funding may soar from 1.25% to a staggering 1.26%, as if the funding is usual. Has anybody got any comments that do we think that's a sensible way forward? Anybody disagree that that's a sensible way forward? No, excellent. Thank you, Christine. I think that we are all broadly in agreement with that logical approach.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and that's been recorded as well in the chat. Okay, so if we move on to school balances, which is Sue.
Right, this report updates Forum. Oh, sorry, I put my camera on. This report updates Forum on the school balances and deficit budgets. The situation remains challenging, particularly during the uncertainty around COVID. The expected balances after the period 6 monitoring have improved by 1.2 million since those at budget setting, and that's mainly due to at the time the lack of the lack of certainty around particularly income budgets around COVID when we were setting budgets, and also the lack of the fact that we've had more clarity on the funding and how the teachers' pay grants and the teachers' pension grants are going to be treated and added into the DSG. Even with additional funding in 21-22, the overall, the 21-22 financial year, the overall school balances are still on a downward trend, and if no action is taken, the number of schools in deficit will continue to rise. The local authority continues to work with schools in deficit to bring them back into balance where possible, and within particularly within the 3-year time frame as part of the licence deficit agreements, and the report is for noting.
Thank you for that, Sue. Nice and clear, nice and concise. Any questions? I mean, this just clearly indicates that even though there's more money in the budget, things are still very tough in our sector. Anybody want to comment? I think we should record the lengths that schools have already gone to make sure that we address the deficits as they arise as well, because that position isn't there by accident. That's because everybody's trying really hard. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sue, for that, and thanks, everybody, for making those figures look better. Okay, if we move on to the next item, which is the monitoring report, which I think is back to Christine.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. It's just an update on the current year's budget and the performance. If I could just ask you, Sue, if you wouldn't mind just sharing the papers, and in particular looking at the table in paragraph 1.2. So in paragraph 1.2, I've actually added a summary across the different funding blocks to show what the current forecast position is for the current financial year. So our total overspend before contribution to reserve, the gross overspend is now forecast to be 1.7 million. We have separately a positive contribution to our reserve, which brings our net overspend down to just over £1 million. This is actually an improvement of about £350,000 on the outturn report that we presented to the November meeting. And what I'll do is, if I can just refer colleagues now to Appendix 2 on page 61, and I'll just run through where those particular variances are, and also any specific issues that I don't want to draw your attention to. Just starting with the individual schools block. Sorry, so it's the next one down, Sue, sorry. And we'll start with the individual schools block. We recall that we mentioned as part of the budget report that in the current year budget, to try and respond to all of our pressures in high needs, we'd actually included in the budget an additional 40 places at special schools. 17 of those places have actually been allocated to specific schools, and the remainder of them are in the process of being allocated at the minute, and we're going through a commissioning process. Because those places won't be fully allocated for this financial year, we've identified that there'll be a £200,000 underspend on the special schools budget, and that's one of the main reasons why the position has actually improved since the outturn report in November. Just draw attention to early years, where at the minute we're forecasting that we will be actually on budget, and just referring back to the report, Carol's report earlier on early years. Obviously a lot of challenges in the early years budget, because our final funding for early years will be based on this January census, and it won't be confirmed until spring. At the minute, we don't exactly know what our total funding will be for the year. And because particularly for the autumn term, we had to fund our providers as if COVID hadn't happened, which in some cases meant funding them at the same level of take-up that they had for autumn 19. We still don't know yet what the final outcome is going to be. So for the moment, we are forecasting that the spend will be on budget. Just moving down to the central schools cost, we have an underspending on our early years, which is mainly due to staff vacancies, and as Carol reported, those posts have now been filled, and that is the underspending is based on the vacancies to date. an underspend on schools forum because the only expenditure we have committed at the moment is for the work that was done to host and getting the results for the consultation that we did with our schools on the national funding formula. Moving down to our de-delegated budgets, we have a forecast underspend on insurances, but as we reported in the de-delegation report, those costs have actually been increasing over the last current year. So although we're forecasting an underspend, we haven't proposed a change to the de-delegation funding for next year. As part of the de-delegation, we also talked about the special staff costs, where we said that's an incredibly volatile budget. Last year, we overspent that budget. Up until November, we've been reporting that the costs will be in line with budget, but we are now actually seeing that the costs aren't as great as expected. So we're actually forecasting an underspend this year on that budget of £50,000. Just moving down to our high needs block, our high needs pupils, that the overspends are broadly in line with the overspends that we reported at November, and they're still reflecting the pressures that we have in terms of growth in demand and complexity. The one area that has improved in our high needs is the contingency, where we're now reporting an underspend of almost 115,000. At November, we were reporting an overspend, but what we'd actually allowed for in that budget was the commissioning of the death base. So whilst that commissioning process was going on, had we needed to move the location of the death base, we would have had to spend quite a considerable sum on some infrastructure, and that would be in particular creating soundproofing conditions. But now the commissioning process has completed, the death base will be staying at Townfield, so we've actually reduced our forecast expenditure because we don't need to incur that additional expenditure. So in total, what we're actually looking at for our total costs is actually a gross overspend of 1.5 million. We're forecasting an overspend, i.e. a shortfall of income on our dedication to schools grants, which, as we reported before, was due to the way that we'd actually calculated early years funding for a previous year. But we also have our contribution to reserve of 644,000, which means now we're looking at a net overspend of just over £1 million. Our overspend on the DSG reserve that we brought forward at the beginning of the year was 1.3 million. So we're now looking that we will have a cumulative deficit position on our DSG grant of 2.4 million by the end of the financial year. That's sort of a bit of a summary of where we're up to on the outturn report this year, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, just refer everybody back to some of the previous documentation, which indicated that £2.4 million cumulative deficit is offset by the increase of the grant in the high needs block, and so that nets off against itself. Is that right, Christine?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so any other questions for Christine? Brilliant. You're doing superbly well and keeping these questions very short, Christine. So thank you very much for the clarity of your report. Okay, so that report is noted. Thank you very much. We are getting through it, everybody. So if we can have now the DSG management plan, and this is
me again, I'm afraid.
Christine for a change.
Yes. Just a little bit of some of this report is really on background, which has been included in many previous reports. So as members will be aware, because we had actually had an overspend on our DSG position at the end of the last financial year, it was a requirement of the DFE that we had to start working on a deficit recovery plan. As members will know, we've been working through that during the year, and as we've been working on that plan, at that point in time, we were not certain about what our funding would be going forward for 21-22. But now that funding has actually been confirmed, it does mean that we are looking at a better position than we'd originally were expecting. If I can just refer colleagues to the table on page 64 under paragraph 3.1, just to give a view. So once we had been notified of the additional funding, what we did, we looked at our 2021 forecast expenditure. So that means we're actually including in there all of the pressures which we're currently experiencing in the high needs block. We then looked at the growth in demand that we'd included in the 21-22 budget of 1.2 million, and a significant portion of that relates to the additional 40 places in special schools and the top-up funding that goes with those places. There's been £1 million increase in spend for the teachers' pay grant and employers' contribution grant of around £1 million. So that means within our budget next year, we've got forecast expenditure for high needs of 43.9 million. Our actual funding this year for high needs is 46.6 million, which gives us a positive contribution to reserve of 2.7 million. So whilst that gives us a little bit of comfort going forward, I think partly, I just wanted to point out that last year for 2021, we had an increase of 5.9 million of funding in the high needs block, but we're still forecasting an overspend of £1 million because we know that this is a particular area where we can have significant pressures. So although we've had the benefit of additional funding that we weren't expecting, which gives us in a better place, we obviously need to still continue looking at and reviewing our high needs expenditure, because we need to make sure that we've actually got sustainability for the services we're delivering now, and also looking at sufficiency of financial resources for any developments that we may want to make, and also looking forward into future years. So the plan actions that we've undertaken at the moment is there has been a significant amount of consultation between council officers and also our different stakeholders in identifying what the pressures are and looking at areas of potential reduction. But those areas of reduction, we're purely looking at what the financial impacts would be if we reduce the funding for those services. So what we've outlined in paragraph 4.2 is sort of an improved way going forward of how we might look at those high need services. So in particular, what we're looking at now is a kind of different view and looking at a more detailed review, which will be undertaken by Mark Billions, who's our strategic advisor, and looking at a way forward, which will be convening different workshops with our high need stakeholders, really looking at more sort of co-production of proposals going forward for the high needs block. And it's expected that that work will complete by the end of March, and there'll be a report back to Schools Forum. That's as much as I wanted to say. I don't know whether there are any questions from Forum or whether of my colleagues. Sorry, I can see, Tarun, you've got your hand up there. So I'm sure that you might want to add something to my report.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Christine. Tarun?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Christine. An excellent report again, Christine. Just on that paragraph 4.2, so retrospectively, Chair, we're deeming the period from June 20 to December 20 as engagement and participation, and we're marking the new year from January to March as a more co-production phase where we speak with colleagues, local leaders in education led by our colleague Mark Williams, to move into a co-production phase where we get a consensus of professional opinion from our head teachers on how to deal with the pressures and the growth in the high needs block.
Great, and that's just to reassure colleagues around here who may be worried that this isn't, we aren't just putting this money into the pot and thinking that everything's hunky-dory. That work continues, and that review of that high needs budget is part of this action, and it's part of our ongoing work with Mark Williams, and we'll get a report about that. Is that right?
That is correct, Chair.
Great. John?
Yeah, I've been involved with co-production with a number of people to do with SEND, and part of it is about the stakeholders having an equal voice and a place around the table, and yet the stakeholders that you seem to have grouped it around are head teachers. What about the other contributors, and why is there no governor involvement in this? Is it so tight that you can't allow that? Or I know it's difficult to have meetings with lots of people present, but if you want to get full support and you want to get it to move forward, what you don't want to do is to achieve this and then suddenly find that there's a group who haven't been represented, who have got an alternative view?
Sorry, Taryn?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we haven't set out Mark's detailed timetable yet. We've just reported, I think it was the Primary Head Teachers Consultative Group, that Mark was going to help us, work with us and continue this important detailed look at the high needs block. So we haven't excluded anybody yet. I use the phrase local leaders in education quite a lot. School governors certainly are part of that. And as colleagues will know, I work closely with the parent forum as well. So we haven't set out the timetable, so nobody's been missed out. And as inclusive as we were with the engagement and participation phase, we hope to mirror that with this next phase, and we can always improve on that if there's a specific group who want to speak to us.
Thanks for that, Taryn. Is it likely that Forum will get a report on that in May, or is that too early? Sorry, that was for Taryn, yeah.
That's okay. So I don't have the answer to that, Chair, but what we do know is that Mark's work is due to conclude in March. So if that timetable is adhered to, I don't see why we shouldn't be able to report something to the May Forum.
I think that'd be quite welcome. We've been concerned about this budget for a while, haven't we? So that would be nice to get that. Taryn, you just put your hand up again.
Yeah. Mr. Williams has already done an interim verbal report to our primary head teacher colleagues, so there is information available already. It's not the final version, but he's updating us as he goes along.
Excellent. I've had a conversation with him myself, so I know he's of sound mind, as they say. Excellent. Anybody else want to make any other comments other than to note that report? Reiterate that. Excellent report. Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, so we are nearly, you'll be glad to know, at the end of this. So we have item 17, which is the membership review, which I think illustrates that we have some members who are coming close to their term of office, and we have some vacancies. Sue, just want to give us a quick scan through that? Sue, do you want to make any comments on that as clerk?
Goodness, I'm one of those terrible people who you have to shout, take your mic off. Right, I'll start again. This report updates Forum on its current representation. There are currently three academy vacancies, and requests have been sent out twice now, but there have been no responses received. There's no longer any primary academy representatives either, because they resigned earlier in the year. My concern is that as we move through the year, we have a further three academy representatives whose term of office is due to finish at the end of August. They will be able to reapply as part of the process, and the regulations say that the process has to be opened out to everybody. But if they don't then choose to reapply for those positions, that will leave us with 6 vacancies in the academy sector, and that's quite a large number. On a happier note, we have new members. Steve Elliott is a primary head teacher, and Julie Merry has joined us as a primary governor rep, and the report is for noting.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sue, and that report is noted. And we asked this morning at the secondary heads meeting, and I've spoken to Kate Frost about getting something through primary heads about getting representation. John, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quickie. I know a while ago when this was put through the CIV, academies and the proportional representation redistributed who represented whom. But I note that there's no secondary governor representative Now, you might say that most secondaries are now academies and they've got representation there, but the representation comes from academy representative, which means they could all be primary biased. And tonight's voting has led us to the fact that poor old Simon, or poor young Simon, has had to vote on behalf of secondaries on his own. What is the thoughts on that?
Right. The regulation states clearly that the primary, secondary and academy representation has to be based on pupil numbers. And because we now only have 4 secondary schools, then we're in a situation where that only leaves us with 1 secondary member, and it is a head teacher. What the regulation don't do is they don't allocate out the academy reps between primary and secondary. However, I think Forum have made it clear in the past that it would only be reasonable to have academy representation in the primary sector as well. Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, it answers the question. It doesn't really make it right. I understand that your hands are tied by the
unfortunately it's the regulation and we have to abide by it.
I absolutely agree. And because of the struggles to get academy reps, you are pretty much going to take anybody that you can get. You can't hold a place back for somebody representing a secondary academy when you've got people queuing up to be primary academy members.
I'm sure there's an orderly queue of people who are desperate to be members of this august body.
And it doesn't just have to, again, in the academy sector, it doesn't just have to be head teachers. It could be, again, people within their governing bodies or their structures that they have. Or if they're a trust, it could be a member on the trust board.
Absolutely. Noted. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And then any more on that? And then finally, just look at the work plan. I can see that we've got in May coming up the high needs funding. So that's the high needs working party, and there is an item in there that says behaviour support and school improvements, which is fairly important given the events that we've talked about this evening. Do we have dates? The 11th of May. Does that give us time to get to Forum? What date's Forum? Sue, what day is that? The 15th? Is the 11th of the Forum meeting?
The 11th, based on previous years, then yeah, it is quite early though. Then it starts falling in. It starts getting too close to the June one. These two are quite close together.
Yeah, it would be possibly good to get a working party. So if I just email people from the high needs working group to get together, possibly to have a look at what the work that Mark's done with Tyrone on a couple of weeks before that might help. Okie dokie. So has anybody got anything else for this evening? No, in that case, can I thank everybody for their attendance tonight? It's been a very healthy debate and discussion and very productive. So thank you very much for that. Christine, could I just have a chat to you at the end, if that's okay? And
yeah, certainly.
Paul? Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Good evening. Bye-bye.
I'm taking off the recording now as well.
Thank you, Sue.
Okay.
Am I in detention, am I?
No, I just want to wait till we're clear of everybody. I just want to talk about the implications of that and the timeline around May, and what we're going to have to get through, because that's